Can you talk to what is syntax and what is grammar? So you wrote a book on syntax.
I did. You were asking me before about how do I figure out what a dependency structure is? And I'd say the dependency structures aren't that hard to generally. I think there's a lot of agreement of what they are for almost any sentence in most languages. I think people will agree on a lot of that. There are other parameters in the mix such that some people think there's a more complicated grammar than just a dependency structure. And so, like Noam Chomsky, he's the most famous linguist ever. And he is famous for proposing a slightly more complicated syntax. And so he invented phrase structure grammar. So he's well known for many, many things, but in the 50s and in the early 60s, but late 50s, he was basically figuring out what's called formal language theory.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he figured out sort of a framework for figuring out how complicated language, a certain type of language might be, so-called phrase structure grammars of language might be. And so his idea was that maybe we can think about the complexity of a language by how complicated the rules are, okay? And the rules will look like this. They will have a left-hand side and it'll have a right-hand side.
Mm-hmm.
Something on the left-hand side will expand to the thing on the right-hand side. So we'll start with an S, which is like the root, which is a sentence, okay? And then we're going to expand to things like a noun phrase and a verb phrase is what he would say, for instance, okay? An S goes to an NP and a VP is a kind of a phrase structure rule. And we figure out what an NP is. An NP is a determiner and a noun, for instance, and a verb phrase is something else, is a verb and another noun phrase and another NP, for instance. Those are the rules of a very simple phrase structure, okay? And so he proposed phrase structure grammar as a way to sort of cover human languages. And then he actually figured out that, well, depending on the formalization of those grammars, you might get more complicated or less complicated languages. And so he said, well, these are things called context-free languages. That rule that he thought human languages tend to be what he calls context-free languages. But there are simpler languages, which are so-called regular languages, and they have a more constrained form to the rules of the phrase structure of these particular rules. So he basically discovered and kind of invented ways to describe the language, and those are phrase structure, a human language. And he was mostly interested in English initially in his work in the 50s.
So quick questions around all this. So formal language theory is the big field of just studying language formally.
Yes, and it doesn't have to be human language there. We can have computer languages, any kind of system which is generating some set of expressions in a language, and those could be like the statements in a computer language, for example. So it could be that, or it could be human language.
So technically, you can study programming languages.
Yes, and have been heavily studied using this formalism. There's a big field of programming languages within the formal language.
Okay, and then phrase structure grammar is this idea that you can break down language into this SNP, VP type of thing.
It's a particular formalism for describing language. Okay, so and Chomsky was the first one. He's the one who figured that stuff out back in the 50s. And that's equivalent, actually. The context-free grammar is kind of equivalent in the sense that it generates the same sentences as a dependency grammar would. As the dependency grammar is a little simpler in some way. You just have a root, and it goes like, we don't have any of these. The rules are implicit, I guess. We just have connections between words. The phrase structure grammar is kind of a different way to think about the dependency grammar. So it's slightly more complicated, but it's kind of the same in some ways.
So to clarify, dependency grammar is the framework under which you see language, and you make the case that this is a good way to describe language.
That's correct.
And Noam Chomsky is watching this, is very upset right now. So let's, I'm just kidding. But what's the difference between, where's the place of disagreement between phrase structure grammar and dependency grammar?
They're very close. So phrase structure grammar and dependency grammar aren't that far apart. I like dependency grammar because it's more perspicuous, it's more transparent about representing the connections between the words. It's just a little harder to see in phrase structure grammar. The place where Chomsky sort of devolved or went off from this is he also thought there was something called movement. Okay, and and that's where we disagree. Okay, that's the place where I would say we disagree. And I mean, maybe we'll get into that later. But the idea is,
Yeah.
if you want to, do you want me to explain that now, or
I would love. Can you
Oh,
explain
okay.
movement?
Movement. Okay, so
You're saying
Chomsky
so
was,
many interesting
yeah,
things.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so here's the movement is Chomsky basically sees English and he says, okay, I said, we had that sentence earlier, like it was like two dogs entered the room. Let's change it a little bit. Say two dogs will enter the room. And he notices that, hey, English, if I want to make a question, a yes/no question from that same sentence, I say, instead of two dogs will enter the room, I say, will two dogs enter the room? Okay, there's a different way to say the same idea, and it's like, well, the auxiliary verb, that will thing, it's at the front as opposed to in the middle. Okay, and he looked, if you look at English, you see that that's true for all those modal verbs and for other kinds of auxiliary verbs in English. You always do that. You always put an auxiliary verb at the front. And when he saw that, so if I say I can win this bet, can I win this bet, right? So I move a can to the front. So actually, that's a theory. I just gave you a theory there. He talks about it as movement. That word in the he thinks the declarative is the root, is the sort of default way to think about the sentence, and you move the auxiliary verb to the front. That's a movement theory. Okay, he said, and he just thought that was just so obvious that it must be true, that there's nothing more to say about that this is how auxiliary verbs work in English. There's a movement rule such that like to get from the declarative to the interrogative, you're moving the auxiliary to the front. And it's a little more complicated as soon as you go to simple present and simple past, because, if I say, John slept, you have to say, did John sleep, not slept John, right? And so it's you have to somehow get an auxiliary verb, and I guess underlyingly it's like slept it's a little more complicated than that, but that's his idea. There's a movement, okay? And so a different way to think about that isn't, I mean, then he ended up showing later. So he proposed this theory of grammar which has movement. And there's other places where he thought there's movement, not just auxiliary verbs, but things like the passive in English and things like questions, WH questions, a bunch of places where he thought there's also movement going on. And each one of those, he thinks there's words, phrases and words are moving around from one structure to another, which he called deep structure to surface structure. I mean, there's like two different structures in his theory. Okay. There's a different way to think about this, which is there's no movement at all. There's a lexical copying rule such that the word will or the word can, these auxiliary verbs, they just have two forms. And one of them is the declarative and one of them is the interrogative. And you basically have the declarative one and, I form the interrogative, or I can form one from the other. It doesn't matter which direction you go. And I just have a new entry, which has the same meaning, which has a slightly different argument structure. Argument structure is just a fancy word for the ordering of the words. And so if I say, it was two dogs can or will enter the room. There's two forms of will. One is will declarative, and then I've got my subject to the left, it comes before me, and the verb comes after me in that one. And then the will interrogative is like, I go first. Interrogative, will is first, and then I have the subject immediately after, and then the verb after that. And so you can just generate from one of those words another word with a slightly different argument structure, with different ordering.
And these are just lexical copies.
And
they're not necessarily moving from one to another.
There's no movement.
There's a romantic notion that you have like one main way to use a word, and then you could move it around.
Right.
Which is essentially what movement is implying.
Yeah, but that's the lexical copying is similar. So then then we do lexical copying for that same idea, that maybe the declarative is the source and then we can copy it. And so an advantage there's multiple advantages of the lexical copying story. It's not my story. This is like Ivan Sog, a bunch of linguists have been proposing these stories as well, in tandem with the movement story. Okay, Ivan Sog died a while ago, but he was one of the proponents of the non-movement of the lexical copying story. And so that is that a great advantage is, Chomsky really famously in 1971 showed that the movement story leads to learnability problems. It leads to problems for how language is learned. It's really, really hard to figure out what the underlying structure of a language is if you have both phrase structure and movement. It's like really hard to figure out what came from what. There's like a lot of possibilities there. If you don't have that problem, the learning problem gets a lot easier.
Just say there's lexical copies.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when we say the learning problem, do you mean like humans learning a new language?
Yeah, just learning English. So baby is lying around listening to the crib, listening to me talk, and how are they learning English?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's a 2-year-old who's learning interrogatives and stuff. Or how are they doing that? Are they doing it from are they figuring out? Or so Chomsky said it's impossible to figure it out. Actually, he said it's actually impossible, not hard, but impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, that's where universal grammar comes from. Is that it has to be built in. And so what they're learning is that there's some built-in movement is built in his story, is absolutely part of your language module, and then you're just setting parameters. You're set depending on English is just sort of a variant of the universal grammar, and you're figuring out which orders does English do these things. That's the non-movement story doesn't have this. It's like much more bottom up. You're learning rules. You're learning rules one by one, and there's this word is connected to that word. A great advantage. Another advantage, it's learnable. Another advantage of it is that it predicts that not all auxiliaries might move. Like it might depend on the word, depending on whether you and that turns out to be true. So there's words that don't really work as auxiliary. They work in declarative and not in interrogative. So I can say. I'll give you the opposite first. If I can say, "Aren't I invited to the party?" Okay, and that's an interrogative form, but it's not from "I aren't invited to the party." There is no "I aren't," right? So that's interrogative only, and then we also have forms like ought. I ought to do this. and I guess some old British people can say exactly. It doesn't sound right, does it? For me, it sounds ridiculous. I don't even think ought is great, but I mean, I totally recognize I ought to. It is not too bad, actually. I can say I ought to do this. That sounds pretty good. Yeah.
If I'm trying to sound sophisticated, maybe.
I don't know. It just sounds completely out to me.
Ought I?
Yeah. Anyway, it's so there are variants here. And a lot of these words just work in one versus the other. And that's like fine under the lexical copying story. It's like, well, you just learn the usage. Whatever the usage is what you do with this word. But it's a little bit harder in the movement story. The movement story, like that's an advantage, I think, of lexical copying. And in all these different places, there's all these usage variants which make the movement story a little bit harder to work.
So one of the main divisions here is the movement story versus the lexical copy story.
That's
that
right.
has to do about the auxiliary words and so on. But if you rewind to the phrase structured grammar versus dependency grammar.
Those are equivalent in some sense in that for any dependency grammar, I can generate a phrase structure grammar which generates exactly the same sentences. I just like the dependency grammar formalism because it makes something really salient, which is the lengths of dependencies between words, which isn't so obvious in the phrase structure. In the phrase structure, it's just kind of hard to see. It's in there. It's just very, very. It's opaque.
Technically, I think phrase structure grammar is mappable to dependency grammar,
and vice versa.
Yeah. But there's like these like little labels S and PVP.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For a particular dependency grammar, you can make a phrase structure grammar which generates exactly those same sentences and vice versa. But there are many phrase structure grammars which you can't really make a dependency grammar. I mean, you can do a lot more in a phrase structure grammar, but you get many more of these extra nodes, basically. You can have more structure in there. And some people like that, and maybe there's value to that. I don't like it.
Well, for you, so we should clarify. So dependency grammar, it's just one word depends on only one other word, and you form these trees.
Yes,
and that makes it really puts priority on those dependencies, just like as a tree that you can then measure the distance of the dependency from one word to the other. They can then map to the cognitive processing of these sentences, how easy it is to understand, and all that kind of stuff. So it just puts the focus on just like the mathematical distance of dependence between words. So like it's just a different focus.
Absolutely.
Just continue on the thread of Chomsky because it's really interesting. Because as you're discussing disagreement, to the degree there's disagreement, you're also telling the history of the study of language, which is really awesome. So you mentioned context-free versus regular. Does that distinction come into play for dependency grammars?
No,
Okay.
not at all. I mean, regular languages are too simple for human languages. It's a part of the hierarchy, but human languages are in the phrase structure world are they're at least context free, maybe a little bit harder than that. But so there's something called context sensitive as well, where you can have, like, this is just the formal language description. In a context-free grammar, you have one. This is like a bunch of like formal language theory we're doing here. But
I love it.
Okay, so you have a left-hand side category, and you're expanding to anything on the right. That's a context-free. So like the idea is that category on the left expands independent of context to those things, whatever there are on the right. It doesn't matter what. And a context-sensitive says, okay, I actually have more than one thing on the left. I can tell you only in this context, maybe have like a left and a right context, or just a left context or a right context. I have two or more stuff on the left, tells you how to expand those things in that way. Okay, so it's context sensitive. A regular language is just more constrained, and so it doesn't allow anything on the right. It allows basically it's one very complicated rule is kind of what a regular language is. And so it doesn't have any, I was going to say long distance dependencies. It doesn't allow recursion, for instance. There's no recursion. Recursion is where which is human languages have recursion. They have embedding, and you can't. Well, it doesn't allow center embedded recursion, which human languages have, which is what
center embedded recursion. So within a sentence, within a sentence.
Yeah, within a sentence. So here we're going to get to that. But I the formal language stuff is a little aside. Chomsky wasn't proposing it for human languages. Even he was just pointing out that human languages are context free, and then he was most for human, because that was kind of stuff we did for formal languages, and what he was most interested in was human language, and that's like the movement is where where he sort of set off on the, I would say, a very interesting but wrong foot. It was kind of interesting. I agree. It's kind of a very interesting history. So there's this. So he proposed this multiple theories in 57 and then 65. They all have this framework though. It was phrase structure plus movement. Different versions of the phrase structure and the movement in the 57. These are the most famous original bits of Chomsky's work. And then in 71 is when he figured out that those lead to learning problems. That there's cases where a kid could never figure out which set of rules was intended. And then he said, well, that means it's innate. It's kind of interesting. He just really thought the movement was just so obviously true that he didn't even entertain giving it up. It's just obvious. That's obviously right. And it was later where people figured out that there's all these like subtle ways in which things which look like generalizations aren't generalizations, and they across the category they're word specific, and they kind of work, but they don't work across various other words in the category, and so it's easier to just think of these things as lexical copies. And I think he was very obsessed. I don't know. I'm just guessing that he really wanted this story to be simple in some sense, and language is a little more complicated in some sense. He didn't like words. He never talks about words. He likes to talk about combinations of words. And words are, if you look up a dictionary, there's 50 senses for a common word, right? The word take will have 30 or 40 senses in it. So there'll be many different senses for common words. And he just doesn't think about that. Or doesn't think that's language. I think he doesn't think that's language. He thinks that words are distinct from combinations of words. I think they're the same. If you look at my brain in the scanner while I'm listening to a language I understand, and you compare, I can localize my language network in a few minutes, in like 15 minutes. And what you do is I listen to a language I know, I listen to, maybe some language I don't know, or I listen to muffled speech, or I read sentences, and I read non-words. Like I can do anything like this, anything that's sort of really like English and anything that's not very like English. So I've got something like it and not, and I got to control. And the voxels, which is just, the 3D pixels in my brain that are responding most is a language area. And that's this left lateralized area in my head. And wherever I look in that network, if you look for the combinations versus the words, it's everywhere. It's the same.
That's fascinating.
And so it's like hard to find. There are no areas that we know. I mean, that's it's a little overstated right now. At this point, the technology isn't great. It's not bad, but we have the best way to figure out what's going on in my brain when I'm listening or reading language is to use fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and that's a very good localization method. So I can figure out where exactly these signals are coming from, pretty, down to, millimeters, cubic millimeters or smaller. Okay. Very small. We can figure those out very well. The problem is the when, okay. It's measuring, oxygen. Okay. And oxygen takes a little while to get to those cells. And so it takes on the order of seconds. So I talk fast. I probably listen fast, and I can probably understand things really fast. So a lot of stuff happens in 2 seconds. And so to say that we know what's going on, that the words right now in that network, our best guess is that whole network is doing something similar, but maybe different parts of that network are doing different things. And that's probably the case. We just don't have very good methods to figure that out right at this moment. And so,
since we're kind of talking about the history of the study of language, what other interesting disagreements, and you're both at MIT, or were for a long time. What kind of interesting disagreements there, tension of ideas are there between you and Noam Chomsky? And we should say that Noam was in the linguistics department, and you're, I guess for a time were affiliated there, but primarily brain and cognitive science department, which is another way of studying language. And you've been talking about fMRI. So is there something else interesting to bring to the surface about the disagreement between the two of you? Or other people in the discipline?
Yeah, I mean, I've been at MIT for 31 years, since 1993, and Chomsky's been there much longer. So I met him. I knew him. I met when I first got there, I guess, and we would interact every now and then. I'd say that. So I'd say our biggest difference is our methods, and so that's the biggest difference between me and Noam, is that I gather data from people. I do experiments with people, and I gather corpus data, whatever corpus data is available, and we do quantitative methods to evaluate any kind of hypothesis we have. He just doesn't do that. And so, he has never once been associated with any experiment or corpus work ever. And so it's all thought experiments. It's his own intuitions. So I just don't think that's the way to do things. That's a across the street from us kind of difference between brain and cog sci and linguistics. I mean, not all some of the linguists, depending on what you do, more speech oriented, they do more quantitative stuff. But in the meaning, words and it's combinations of words, syntax, semantics, they tend not to do experiments and corpus analyses.
So on the linguistic side, probably but the method is a symptom of a bigger approach, which is sort of a psychology philosophy side on Noam, and for you, it's more sort of data-driven, sort of almost like mathematical approach.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a psychologist, so I would say we're in psychology. I'm in brain and cognitive science is MIT's old psychology department. It was the psychology department up until 1985, and it became the brain and cognitive science department. And so I mean, my training is in psychology. I mean, my training is math and computer science, but I'm a psychologist. I mean, I don't know what I am.
So data-driven psychologist.
Well, yeah.
You are.
I am what I am, but I'm happy to be called a linguist. I'm happy to be called a computer scientist. I'm happy to be called a psychologist. Any of those things.
But in the actual, like how that manifests itself outside of the methodology is like these subtle differences about the movement story versus the lexical copy story.
Yeah, those are theories, right? So the theories are. But I think the reason we differ in part is because of how we evaluate the theories. And so I evaluate theories quantitatively, and Noam doesn't.
Got it.